I think we should all be very uncomfortable. And I am okay with making people very uncomfortable around these issues.
Welcome to Bitch Talk. I'm your host, Erin.
And I'm co-host Ange, aka Captain Party.
And for more than 11 years, the show has celebrated underrepresented voices in pop culture and beyond.
But not in the snore kind of way, which is why our listeners and followers have graciously voted us Best of the Bay, Best Podcast on 48 Hills for 3 years in a row. Three-peat, bitches.
If you like what you hear, follow us on Instagram and check out our website, Bitch Talk Podcast, and rate us wherever you listen to podcasts.
We're begging you to judge us. When does that ever happen? Oh, you're not going to say anything?
What would I say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, on with the show. Clink.
All right, Bitch Talkers, we are honored to have filmmaker, documentarian Geeta Gandbhir on Bitch Talk. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. We've been kind of watching the trajectory of this film since Sundance and wanting to have you on. So thank you so much for being here. Can you do us a favor and introduce the film to our audience who haven't seen it just yet?
Sure. So The Perfect Neighbor is the story of a small neighborhood in Ocala, Florida, and a murder that took place there. Susan Lawrence shot her neighbor, Ajika Owens, through a locked metal door and tried to use stand your ground as a defense. And the film follows the lead up to that incident and the aftermath.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question since we haven't had you on the show before, and we can't wait to have you back again some point. But I would love for you to tell a little bit about your origin story in filmmaking, just because I read you were a narrative filmmaker at first, and then you moved in the documentary space. So do you mind talking a little bit about that journey?
No, not at all. So I started in narrative filmmaking many years ago, and I began with Spike Lee. My first film was Malcolm X, and Spike Lee. I studied a bunch of things in college that made no sense, and Spike Lee. I studied animation and women's studies. I mean, they were wonderful individually, but didn't necessarily add up to anything. And Spike Lee hired me as an intern, and he put me in the edit room because he made the connection between animation, which is sequential art, and editing. And so that's how I started off my career. I was in scripted for about 11, almost 12 years. And then around 9/11, a lot of the scripted work left New York. Mm-hmm. And so I segued into documentary. I didn't want to leave my city. And then about 15 years ago, I segued into directing.
That is the beautiful thing about telling stories is, you say you studied all these things that didn't make sense, but it's all incorporated in your work now. So it sort of brought you here.
You're right. No, I've seen that to be true. Like that all those things sort of add up. But at the time, I had no idea what they added up to.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. So turning to this documentary, it's so powerful, very emotional, obviously. I just kind of wanted to start with how you got your hands on this story, why you wanted to tell it, and sort of getting access to all of this body cam footage that I can't imagine sifting through.
Sure. So Ajika Owens was a family friend. She was a close friend of two of my relatives, Takima Robinson and Kimberly Robinson Jones. And Kimberly Robinson actually lived in the same community as Ajika, and originally lived in the house that Ajika was living in when the confrontations with Susan began. Mm. She's the one who introduced Ajika to that beautiful little community and thought it would be perfect for her and her young kids because there was such a strong social network there of families kind of raising kids together. And it was an idyllic community until Susan came along. But so the night that Ajika was murdered, we got a phone call from Takima Robinson again, who's my relative and EP on the film, an executive producer. And she told us about the incident. We were immediately on the ground trying to help the family raise the case in the media and to make sure it stayed alive in the media even after Susan's arrest, because we were concerned about the stand your ground laws in Florida. We've seen the incidents that have happened before, particularly Trayvon Martin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where stand your ground was used as a defense in a case where the perpetrator was actually the aggressor and he walked away because of stand your ground. So 2 months later, we received a drive with about 30 hours of materials that pertained to the case: body camera footage, ring camera footage. There was some cell phone footage. There was detective interviews. There was also 911 calls to the police from both Susan and the community that happened on the night of the murder. And so all of that material came to us because the Pamela Dias, who's Ajika's mother, her lawyers had used the Freedom of Information Act and requested all the materials from the police department pertaining to the case. So that's how all those materials became public record. And they were sent to us, and we were asked to sift through them to see if there was anything that would be useful for the news. And it came in a mess, as I said before. It was there was all those things were not necessarily in any chronological order, and we had to synchronize the sound and the video, and sometimes there were 2 police on scene, sometimes there were 10 to 15. It was depending on the incident. The calls could last for hours. The police shut their cameras off and on randomly. It was quite messy. But I used to be an editor, so it took me a couple weeks, but I was able to string it all out. And it was both grief work for me, but also detective work. We felt compelled. We really needed to know what had happened. How does someone pick up a gun and shoot their neighbor to settle such a trivial dispute over children playing in a yard next door where they have permission to be? We couldn't understand how this could happen. And we quickly, after stringing it all out, realized that the footage went back 2 years. And that's something we've never seen. We've never seen that sort of lead up to an incident. And I think Susan called the police so many times that's why that material existed. But most often you see maybe the day of, if there is footage surrounding a crime, or the immediate aftermath. And we are numb to this with gun violence. We are so used to the aftermath, the grieving family, the funeral. There's a shooting every week. Some sort of shooting, usually multiple. So that's when we realized there was a story here that we could really tell that might be different, that might impact differently.
So I do think a lot of documentary filmmaking is detective work. And so I want to ask, what was the conversation with your team around using the body cam footage? Because it's such a different way to tell the story. And I feel like not sometimes you've done the work, but it could be hard and pretty challenging. So what was the conversation, and were people like, yeah, that's not gonna, we can't do that?
No, it was really hard. And to be honest, it was a big risk because you lack context. We made a film where you cannot lean into the talking head to soften things for you. We cannot lean into them to tell the pieces that you don't actually see. But my team at Message Pictures, we made the film alongside Park Pictures. SOB Productions also came on board as partners. We were really committed to this vision because, again, coming from a narrative background, I could see it. And the police ultimately functioned as, again, unintentionally, as multicam. They wandered around in pairs, capturing things. And so I saw that I had a vision of how we could put this together. And again, there were times where we weren't sure. We really weren't sure in the edit. But my editor was amazing, Veridiana Lieberman. She believed in my vision, and she sometimes was the one who had to remind me when I would flounder. I'd be like, oh God, how are we going to explain this? It's important. Maybe we should get someone to test. She was like, no, we committed to this, and we also figured out ways to give additional context, which was through the detective interviews. I think we see as documentary filmmakers, we also know it's incredibly important to be balanced in the telling of the story. We wanted to give a 360. So you have Susan's perspective, and you have a lot of it because she's the one who called the cops often. But you only have so much of Ajika. So we figured out a way to use the detective interviews where that was the testimony of the community, almost like a choir, right? Where they tell us their side of what they were experiencing due to Susan's relentless calling of the police, and Susan really weaponizing her whiteness, her privilege against them, and trying to weaponize the police. She tries to do that again and again, and ultimately the police just found her to be a nuisance. But again, she was this looming threat that the community experienced, and over time it got worse and worse. And that's what we see in the film. I also wanted to make something that felt like a thriller. I really wanted to hook the audience and hold them and have the film be a Trojan horse for the messaging. Because I think show and not tell works so much better with advocacy films. And with gun violence, it's, again, there is such a barrier to compromise and to conversation that we really felt that if we could show people, we would reach their hearts and minds.
It definitely leaves a lasting imprint. Aaron and I were talking about it after we watched it and sort of processing together how we were feeling. And it's so frustrating when you talk about was such a preventable crime. You said there's years. This dates back to years, this issue. And it's like, at one point do they decide the cops stop coming and you bring a social worker, and now a social worker's on the case, or someone from the community as a mediator. Like, why didn't this happen?
How much better that would have been. And I think about that all the time. And I think what you see in the film is the helplessness of the cops, but also their biases. They come to the scene. Again, oftentimes people have said to us, they screen the film and they're like, oh, the cops were great. They're surprised. Because too, we see so much police violence that they assume the cops are going to come in and, throw people to the ground or have a knee in somebody's neck. They did not do that, but it was ultimately there was negligence on their part. They never saw Susan as a threat, and that's because she did weaponize her status, her privilege. Again, and she also weaponized victimhood. She constantly portrayed herself as a victim to them, and they believed her because of their own biases. And they did not see the neighborhood. They were empathetic to the neighborhood, but they didn't see them as people who needed to be protected. So Susan was not a threat. The neighborhood was not really vulnerable. It was just, their mediation was to just stay on this side of the street, just ignore her, don't bother her, leave her alone. Susan's access to a gun, and anyone's access to a gun in that neighborhood, makes them a threat. So this is what was so dangerous. And the police, again, the system failed the community, and also they failed Susan. This is something that needs to be talked about. Susan should have never had a gun. And there were points in the film where the police could have and should have flagged her. Like there was a scene where she, it's noted that she drove her truck repeatedly into the gate of a tow pound that she was locked in. And she says that she had a panic attack, and her behavior is unstable and erratic. How is she allowed to have a gun? We hope the film raises all these questions and makes people think about these issues deeply.
Yeah, that was our conversation just around mental health. And when we talk about defund the police, it's more like take some of the money that's going towards the police and let's talk about the social part of that. And it would have been great to have someone come in and talk to Susan and maybe figure out what was really going on with her.
100%.
Yeah, so I hope there's a conversation around mental health as well, because that was obviously an issue. And mental health plus checks and balances and getting a gun if you're unwell mentally. I wanted to ask you, I saw an interview where you talk about this kind of storytelling and leading with humanity. And so can you talk about that in this storytelling in particular?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we were very aware of is that the police body camera footage and police body camera footage in general is a tool of the state that is often used to surveil us as communities of color. It is used to dehumanize us, to criminalize us, and to protect the police. And we're very aware of the perspective. Again, it's the police coming into this neighborhood, but what the police unintentionally capture, because of their multiple visits, again, is the community as they were before. So we wanted to subvert the normal usage of police body camera footage, or it's what it's usually intended for, by making sure to showcase in this film the things that they caught that they didn't necessarily mean to. Again, this gorgeous community living together, a diverse community, raising children together. For example, the neighbor, the mother who comes out, and when she's talking to the police and they ask her, which one of these is your kid? She says, oh, they're all mine. And then the father comes out and says, I look out for these kids like they're my own, and then you also have the children themselves who are hilarious and just playing. They are also they are so secure. They feel safe in their neighborhood. Susan is the only outlier. They also say, they're very precocious. The little girl who says, I think everyone laughs at this, but when she goes, we're 11.
Yeah. That was my favorite. Yes.
11. You cannot, what so often happens to us as people of color is after a crime is we are criminalized, and children, if they are children, are adultified. You saw with Tamir Rice, right?
Yeah.
Again, he was a child and he was shot for playing with a toy gun. So what you see with these children, I think, in this footage is you cannot adultify them. They are, as Soledad O'Brien, one of our EPs says, they are the kiddiest kids, and they are 100% themselves. In the footage, and I think that was really important. Again, we are still aware of the fact that the community is going to interact with the police a certain way because they fear for their safety with the police as well. But it's our as filmmakers, it was really important to us to use, again, these moments that they unintentionally caught to show, again, the humanity of this community, to lead with that humanity. But what's fascinating to me is the way that you see Susan interact with the police versus the community. The children in the community are incredibly polite. The children don't even curse in front of the cops. They spell out curse words, Jack, AS. She called us the B word, the P word. To this day, I don't know what the P word is.
Same.
I was like, there's only one, but I was like, that doesn't make sense anyway.
I don't know what they meant, but they wouldn't repeat it. Susan, on the other hand, has plenty to say because of, again, her belief that she is in the right.
Yeah.
And that is her privilege. And again, she weaponizes that against the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on the kids. I loved seeing them and them talking to the police as kids. But as a documentarian, you take on such great responsibility because these are human lives that you're showing the world. So can you talk about did you have any cautiousness or trepidation? It's so heavy what we're seeing these kids go through, and how active were they as participants in the storytelling?
Not at all. We
Okay.
did not show this to the children, nor would we. They are too young, and we don't think it's right to. They are on a healing journey, so we wanted to keep the process away from them. But we did not work with. Again, we consulted with Pamela, Ajika's mother. Particularly in the beginning, I asked her permission to make this film because I had nothing else to offer her. And she is incredibly brave. And she essentially, again, in the vein of Mamie Till, Emmett Till's mother, she wanted the world to know what happened to her baby. If you would remember, Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket funeral for her son who was lynched and had reporters come and take pictures because she said the world needs to know what happened to my baby and what's happening down here to us. And Pamela is of the same mindset. She is the bravest person I know. She was like, no, the world needs to see it. They needs to see it as it happened because this is the true aftermath of gun violence. And I know there is questions around, again, the ethics of showing a family and children in their worst moment. But again, if we do not bear witness to these types of crimes, we are not motivated to make change, and they continue to be perpetrated in the dark. I think about George Floyd, and this is something Pamela and I talked about too, how that video sparked a movement. And it was horrible that it had to come to that. But we are in a place where we are so desensitized and so dehumanized by gun violence in some ways, that she felt that it's necessary. She wants the world to know. So it was really following her lead that we decided to leave in some of the most painful things. And we asked the audience to bear witness, but we also hope that it will motivate people to take action. And Pamela always says, I don't want everyone to think of this as just a tragedy. I want this to create a groundswell and to make people understand that what we tolerate should be intolerable. That these are our communities. This is our society. We have a right to feel safe. And by witnessing, again, how often we hear about gun violence all too often, but to make people actually live in it is something she wanted to do. And I am in agreement. I think we should all be very uncomfortable. I am okay with making people very uncomfortable around these issues.
Speaking being uncomfortable, have any of the police seen this film, and do they have any feedback?
No, we have not shared it with the police, nor are we required to, because again, you do with body camera footage is important, obviously, for people who are heavily featured. You obviously want their permit. The community is important to us, but the police, again, they're not civilians, so we are not required. But we do think that this might raise questions around the usage of police body camera footage. There's about 8 states that have police body camera footage required. And we know that without this footage, Susan's conviction may have gone differently. So again, we're sure this will raise conversation about it. And we do think that this could be used as a training tool for the police. Again, as individuals, the police were perhaps not terrible, but you can see the complete systemic failure in this film.
Well, I think with any gun violence, I'm always curious about, well, what do the police think about this? They're the ones that are the first responders, so they cannot not be affected by it. So that's why I'm curious, if they saw this film, maybe that would open a conversation around it.
What is interesting, Pamela has said that that the police afterwards, of course, during the trial and the sentencing, that there were officers who spoke to her, and they, particularly the detectives who you see in the film, who were the ones questioning Susan, and that they told her repeatedly how sorry they were for her loss. And I think one of the things that I did see in the film is the detective who asks Susan, have you been on social media lately? Have you seen the news and anything about the case? And Susan responds, oh yes, that people are saying that I did this and I did that. And, and none of it is true. And he says, you know what I saw? I saw 4 children who don't have a mother to go home to anymore. So I think there is obviously empathy. I do think, again, the police are human beings, right? I don't think anyone could have been there that night and been unaffected. So, but again, the problem is the system. So I think that what we're hoping for is that eventually this can be used in some way to inform police procedure.
Well, thank you so much for this film. It's a brave film to put out, and thank you to Netflix for putting it out. I think more eyes will be on it. So Geeta, thank you so much for being on Bitch Talk.
Thank you for having us. And the film premieres on the 17th of this week, so we're hoping it is well watched. And again, we can push for change around stand your ground and gun reform.
Thanks for joining us on today's show. You can find more information about this episode in our show notes.
If you're missing us, you can visit us at bitchtalkpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter and buy us a cup of coffee.
Did you know we're also on the radio? You can find us at bff.fm.
And lastly, rate and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. All the cool bitches are doing it.